In 1991, over the deserts of Kuwait, Iraqi soldiers started surrendering to an aircraft before it had even fired a shot. Not to tanks rolling toward their position, not to infantry closing in, to a plane circling overhead, one so ugly the US Air Force itself almost refused to build it. Nicknamed after a wild pig, they called it the Warthog. And by the time the Gulf War ended, it had become one of the most feared aircraft in the sky. Not because it was fast, and it wasn't. Not because it was stealthy, because it was about as far from stealthy as an aircraft gets, but because everyone who saw it knew exactly what came next. This is the story of how a slow, ugly, twin-engine jet built around a gun instead of the other way around became the thing enemy pilots and enemy soldiers alike prayed they'd never see circling above them. To understand why the A-10 terrified people, you have to go back to a problem the Air Force spent years refusing to admit it had. Through the Vietnam War, the job of close air support, hitting enemy troops fighting close enough to touch American soldiers on the ground, kept getting handed to aircraft that were never built for it. The F-100 Super Sabre, the F-4 Phantom. Fast jets built to intercept other fast jets, doing a job that demanded almost the opposite skill set. A jet moving at 500 miles an hour has maybe a second and a half to spot a target on the ground, line it up and fire before the terrain underneath is already a memory. Pilots were doing the most precise job in the entire war, at the least precise speed available to them. Ground troops paid first. Friendly fire incidents happened. Targets got missed. But the aircraft paid too, because speed doesn't protect you from small arms fire and shrapnel when the mission requires you to fly in low anyway. And by the war's end, the Air Force had lost hundreds of aircraft to exactly that kind of ground fire. By the early 1970s, someone finally asked a different question out loud. Instead of adapting a fighter jet for a job it was never designed to do, what if you built an aircraft around the job itself, from the ground up, with nothing borrowed? That question ran straight into resistance from inside the Air Force's own ranks. This was an institution built by fighter pilots for fighter pilots, and the idea of investing serious money in something slow, unglamorous, and incapable of dogfighting a MiG offended a lot of people with stars on their shoulders. It took a program called AX, a design competition, and a genuine internal fight to get the aircraft built at all. Fairchild Republic won that competition, and the result was the A-10 Thunderbolt II, though almost nobody who ever flew it, worked on it, or watched it overhead ever called it that. The gun came first, the airplane came second, built around it, which is not how aircraft normally get made. The gun was the GAU-8 Avenger, a 7-barrel rotary cannon so enormous that engineers had to offset the aircraft's own nose landing gear just to fit the ammunition drum sitting behind it. It fires 30mm rounds at a rate of roughly 3,900 rounds a minute, and the rounds themselves come tipped with depleted uranium, dense enough to punch straight through the armored hull of a main battle tank. Pilots and ground crews came to know the sound it made as one continuous tearing note, the brrrt that would later turn into its own strange piece of internet culture. Memes and merchandise built around a sound most people will thankfully never hear pointed at them. But long before anyone was printing it on a t-shirt, it was the sound that made Iraqi tank crews climb out of their vehicles and run, because there was nothing inside that armor worth staying for once that gun opened up. Around that gun, engineers built what pilots still call a flying bathtub. Not a metaphor, not close to one. The cockpit sits inside an actual tub of titanium armor, roughly 1,200 pounds of it, thick enough to deflect rounds up to 23 millimeters. The two engines sit high on the fuselage and set apart from each other so that a single hit doesn't take out both at once, and the aircraft can limp home on whichever one survives. The flight controls run on redundant hydraulic systems, and if both of those fail, a set of manual cables lets a pilot fly the aircraft using nothing but physical strength pulling on pulleys. No hydraulics, no computer assistance, just cable and muscle. This wasn't an aircraft engineered to avoid getting hit. It was engineered on the assumption that it would get hit repeatedly in combat and keep flying anyway. Every design choice underneath that ugly airframe was built around one idea: absorb the damage and bring the pilot home regardless. Which is exactly what happened, again and again, in ways that turned individual missions into legend inside the squadron rooms where pilots tell these stories to each other. In April 2003, over Baghdad, Captain Kim Campbell was flying close air support when Iraqi ground fire tore through her A-10 and destroyed the hydraulic system completely. In most modern fighters, that failure ends the flight immediately, often with the pilot ejecting. Campbell lost stick control entirely. No stick, no hydraulics. Instead, she reverted to manual reversion, hand-flying the aircraft using nothing but cables and raw mechanical linkage for close to an hour, all the way back to base. When the ground crew inspected the jet afterward, they counted more than 100 holes in the airframe. She landed it anyway. The aircraft that should have been unflyable brought her home regardless, and her call sign afterward, Killer Chick, became one more entry in a long list of A-10 stories that sound made up until you check the record and find out they aren't. Stories like that didn't stay contained inside the Air Force. They traveled to the people standing on the other end of that gun. And that's where the fear stopped being abstract and started shaping actual battlefield decisions. By the time Operation Desert Storm began in 1991, Iraqi ground forces had already built a reputation around the aircraft loitering above their positions for hours at a time, patient in a way fast jets never could be. Gulf War veterans have described Iraqi units surrendering directly to A-10s circling overhead. Soldiers waving white cloth at a plane that hadn't fired a single round at them yet, because they'd already watched or heard about what it did to the unit dug in next to theirs. According to accounts from pilots who flew those missions, Iraqi prisoners repeatedly said they feared the Warthog's gun more than conventional artillery, because artillery was something you could survive with a little luck and a deep enough hole. The Avenger cannon left nothing to luck. When it found you, the outcome wasn't in question. But the fear didn't stop at the men dug into trenches. It reached into the cockpits of enemy pilots too. And that's the part of this story that gets skipped over most often. The A-10 was never built to dogfight, not even close. It's slow by fighter standards. It doesn't have anywhere near the thrust-to-weight ratio to outturn a dedicated interceptor. And nobody who designed it ever expected it to win an aerial engagement against a MiG. And yet, during the Gulf War, A-10s recorded confirmed air-to-air kills against Iraqi helicopters, using that same 30mm cannon to shoot enemy aircraft directly out of the sky, instead of tanks on the ground. For a helicopter pilot flying reconnaissance or troop support, that single fact changed the entire calculation of what airspace was safe. You weren't only avoiding a threat to the soldiers underneath you anymore, you were now the target yourself, hunted by an aircraft nobody had trained you to fight, one that most air forces had written off as too slow to be dangerous in the air. That reputation hardened into something close to psychological warfare, whether the Air Force ever planned it that way or not. Iraqi commanders reportedly began routing helicopter movements and troop convoys specifically to avoid airspace where A-10s were known to be operating, the same way you'd reroute a supply line around a minefield you couldn't clear. The aircraft didn't even need to be present in the sky at a given moment to have that effect. Its reputation alone was already reshaping how the other side moved, planned, and made decisions on the ground, hours before a single Warthog ever showed up. Which raises the obvious question: if this aircraft was this effective, this feared by the people fighting against it, why has the Air Force spent the better part of 3 decades trying to retire it? The answer says almost as much about institutional politics as it does about the airplane itself. The A-10 was built for one mission and one mission only: killing tanks and protecting troops on the ground. And that single-purpose mission has never fit neatly into an air force built around fighters, bombers, and increasingly stealth technology and multi-role platforms that can do a dozen jobs adequately instead of one job perfectly. Every few years, budget planners have proposed retiring the fleet in favor of newer aircraft that can technically perform close air support, among other missions, faster, with a much smaller radar signature. And every few years, soldiers and Marines who've actually called in Warthog support during a firefight have pushed back hard. Because there's a real difference between an aircraft that can theoretically handle close air support as one job among many, and one built from the ground up to survive doing it low and slow, exactly where the mission needs it to be, absorbing hits a faster jet would never walk away from. That tension between what the aircraft actually is and what the institution that owns it would rather be flying instead has followed the A-10 through nearly its entire service life. But on the ground, among the troops who've needed it circling overhead during the worst moments of a deployment, that debate has never really existed in the first place. Ask an infantryman who's had a Warthog show up during a firefight what he thinks about retiring the aircraft, and you'll get a very different answer than the one coming out of a Pentagon budget hearing. Because that's really what this whole story comes down to. The A-10 was never meant to be elegant. It was never meant to be fast or quiet or easy to admire from a distance the way a stealth fighter is. It was built to absorb damage that would kill nearly any other aircraft in the inventory, and to keep delivering that gun onto target anyway, mission after mission, hit after hit. Enemy soldiers learned to fear the sound of it before they ever laid eyes on the plane itself. Enemy pilots learned to fear the airspace it controlled, whether or not a Warthog happened to be there that particular day. Almost 50 years after its first flight, an aircraft the Air Force once treated as an unwanted afterthought is still flying combat missions, still absorbing hits that should ground it, and still carrying a reputation that no amount of budget paperwork has managed to retire alongside it. So the question worth sitting with isn't really whether some newer aircraft could technically replace it on paper. It's whether anything built for elegance could ever earn the same fear on both sides of a conflict that an ugly flying gun with a titanium bathtub bolted into it managed to earn simply by refusing to go down.